Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip is a continuation in the series on the 3 most dangerous lines to leave blank in a real estate contract. So please watch the other 2 videos I've done, and today's video has to do with the binding agreement date. Do not leave that blank in a purchase and sale agreement, and I'm going to tell you why. So the other 2 most dangerous lines to leave blank in a real estate contract have to do with the appraisal and financing contingency time frame and the due diligence period. So please check out the videos on those other 2. But today we're going to talk about the binding agreement date. So why is this date so important? Well, this is important because this is the time frame from which all of the contractual contingencies are timed. And in a for counting purposes, the binding agreement date is day 0. That's just parenthetically, but just want to let you know that the binding agreement date is day 0. But this is the time frame from which all the contingencies are timed. So it's very important because if a party is going to terminate based on an agreed upon contingency, they need to send that notice of termination prior to the expiration of that contingency in order to protect the earnest money, in order to meet the terms of what the parties had agreed to and protect the earnest money. So it's very important because if you're off by a day, it depends on, there could be thousands of dollars at risk, whether the buyer, typically it's a buyer terminating. There's other situations where it's a seller, but typically it is a buyer terminating. So there are thousands of dollars at risk where a buyer is terminating, believing they are within their contractual time frame to do so and will get their earnest money back. Where if they're outside of that, then the buyer would be in default of the contract, and the seller would be entitled to those funds as liquidated damages for the buyer's default. So don't leave it blank. Short and sweet. However, there are a couple of complications and a couple of issues. Number one is, how is binding agreement date determined? And basically, what is it, how is it defined, and how is it determined? And I will tell you that GAR, the Georgia Association of Realtors Contracts, has changed that quite a bit in the 2022 contract form. So you need to pay attention, agents, buyers and sellers, but agents, y'all need to pay attention to this. So what is the binding agreement date? The binding agreement date is defined as when all parties have knowledge that a contract has been accepted. So you've got one party that makes an offer to the other party. So for example, let's say you have a buyer that makes an offer to a seller. If the seller signs it, you then have an accepted contract, but those terms are not binding upon the parties. They're not enforceable. You do not have a binding agreement date because at this point in time, the buyer does not know if they're going to get back a signed accepted contract, a counter offer, or a rejection or no response. So it's not binding at this point. So in my example, a buyer makes an offer to a seller signs it. You have an accepted contract. Once that seller sends notice of acceptance back to the buyer, then at that point you have a binding contract where the terms are binding upon the parties and the buyer and seller are locked into that contract. Again, all parties have noted, the party that made the offer, the last offer, counter offer, in my example, it's the buyer over here, when they have notice of acceptance. This party makes the offer, this party accepts it, this sends it back, this party now has notice of acceptance. Now it's binding. Same thing. Let's say buyer makes an offer to the seller. Seller makes a counter offer back to the buyer. Buyer signs it. Not binding. Seller doesn't know if they're going to get it back signed, if they're going to get a rejection, or if they're going to get another counter offer. Buyer makes an offer to the seller. Seller makes a counter offer back to the buyer. Buyer signs it. We have an accepted contract. And then once the buyer sends notice of acceptance to the seller, then we have a binding contract. So the party that made the last offer or counteroffer. In my first situation, it's the buyer making the offer to the seller. In my second example, it's the seller making a counteroffer to the buyer. So the party that made the last offer or counteroffer, once they get notice of acceptance, then you have a binding contract. So that's the definition of a binding contract. In the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors form, and in the RE form, it goes on under the notices section to talk about especially electronic notice by email, because that's how the majority of agents are doing their contracts nowadays. It goes on to define when it is determined, when this notice of acceptance is, how we can figure that out with the contract with respect to email. And in the GAR contract, it says this in the RE forms contract too, that notice is deemed received when the sender can prove they sent it. So by email, when in my first example, buyer makes an offer to the seller, seller signs it and accepts it, not binding. When the sender can prove they sent the acceptance back to the buyer, when their email shows that attachment with that date, that is considered received by the other party. So both the GAR and the RE forms contract define how you can tell when notice is received. And it goes on to say that per electronic notice, so email, notice is deemed or considered received by the recipient when the sender can prove they sent it, even if the buyer doesn't open the email. So that's the date that that would be the binding agreement date. So should be no problem. Binding agreement date would be, so let's say for example, buyer writes an offer on April 20th to the seller. Let's say the seller signs it on April 20th and then emails back the accepted signed contract to the buyer on the 20th. The binding agreement date is the 20th. It should be written on the bottom of the contract by the party that made the last offer, the 20th, because that's when they received the notice of acceptance. No problem. Here's the problem. What happens if parties are working at night, buyer writes an offer to the seller? Let's say the seller signs it on April 20th, but they don't send it back or send it to their agent who doesn't send it back until the next day, April 21st. What's the binding agreement date? The binding agreement date is actually now April 21st, even though the signatures are dated April 20th, because it's not binding until this party has notice of acceptance. They did not get notice of acceptance. That email with the accepted contract was not sent until April 21st. So the true binding agreement date is April 21st, notice of acceptance, regardless of what dates are on the contract. So far, hopefully good. The problem is what happens, and this party, the party that made the last offer or counteroffer, should technically be the party that fills in the binding agreement date, because that's when it's binding, when it gets back to them. Here's a problem. What happens if it's left blank? Well, on one hand, it can be determined by this process, by the definition in the notices section. Another issue, but I'm going to come back to that. Another issue is what happens if the sellers sign it on April 20th, but they don't get it back to their agent, or their agent doesn't send it back to the buyer, in my example, until the 21st. But they have gone ahead and filled in the binding agreement date of the 20th. Send it back to the 21st. By the definitions, the actual binding agreement date is the 21st. However, you have a contract form that has April 20th filled in as the binding agreement date. You have an issue because one party thinks, okay, so what happens? What is the binding agreement date? So again, we've got the actual binding agreement date per the terms of notice, and the definition is April 21st. But the buyer receives the signed contract back, and the binding agreement date has already been filled in by the seller side that says April 20th. Well, let's say there was a 5-day buyer's due diligence period. Well, let's say the buyer terminates 45, 21, 22, 23, 45, 26 on April 26th. Did they terminate, and are they entitled to their earnest money back prior to the end of due diligence or not? Well, the binding agreement date per the definition and the terms of notice is actually the 21st. So 21st is day 0. So 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. The buyer right now would have until 11:59 p.m. on that date to terminate and get their earnest money back. However, the seller thinks that the binding agreement date was the 20th. And so 20th, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. If the buyer terminates on the 26th, the seller might not be likely to sign the agreement to release the earnest money back to the buyer because they think the buyer's a day after due diligence period. So you've got a lot of issues here. So what do? Well, it's not necessarily the 21st per the 2022 Georgia Association of Realtors, or GAR, contract form. If you are binding on another form or the RE forms, you need to look at the terms of notice and that definition, which would hold. However, in 2022 on the Georgia Association of Realtors contracts, there is information that they have added under the actual purchase and sale agreement. And this is under paragraph C4, which is other provisions. And under paragraph C4, it talks about what if there is a discrepancy to the binding agreement date. Well, first of all, it says that under subparagraph I, it says that in the event there is a dispute over the binding agreement date, it shall be resolved by a court arbitrator having jurisdiction over the dispute, written agreement of the buyer and seller, or by the holder in making a reasonable interpretation to disperse earnest money. So the key thing is by agreement by the buyer and seller. So you agents, if you get a contract back and it has a binding agreement date filled in, but it is not the correct date, you need to address it then and there. The 2022 GAR contract goes on to say in brand new paragraph K, objection to binding agreement date. If the buyer or seller objects to the date as entered on the binding agreement date, in my example, the seller signed it on the 20th, filled in the binding agreement date on the 20th, but actually did not send it back until the 21st. The buyer's agent now is going to have an objection to the binding agreement date because the binding agreement date should be April 21st, but the document they received back has the wrong date on there. It says April 20th. The buyer's agent, the buyer/buyer's agent, must make an objection within 1 day of receiving that binding document, that contract with the binding agreement date filled in incorrectly. The party objecting shall send notice of the objection to the other party. The objection shall then be resolved by written amendment between the buyer and the seller by executing a binding agreement date confirmation. There is a brand new amendment in 2022 under the Georgia Association of Realtors contracts F733 that is a binding agreement date amendment. And if the buyer's agent in my example does not make an objection that it says April 20th on there, if they don't make an objection within 1 day, then the April 20th becomes the new binding agreement date, even though they did not receive that contract back till the 21st. Again, that terminology, that verbiage is specific to the Georgia Association of Realtors contract in 2022. If the parties are binding under the RE forms contract, it does have the definition of a binding agreement date and it does have the terms of notice, but it does not have this new language about a potential change in the binding agreement date if an objection is not lobbied. Again, this date is extremely important because there are thousands of dollars in earnest money on the line. If there is a question as to did the buyer terminate prior to the expiration of an agreed upon contingency or a day after the expiration of that contingency. Woo! Thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next video on the third most dangerous line to leave blank in a real estate contract, which is going to be the due diligence period or buyer's right to terminate period. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.